Tovah, thank you so much for coming on the Mindful Parenting podcast. I love talking to people who are like experts in toddlers and things like that because I was not like a natural kid person, and I was like always kind of like amazed at the people who were like really into toddlers and small children. Like, wow, you're like a special breed of people who are very into toddlers. And so
Yeah.
I'm just curious about like for you, what was it? What was it? Maybe like a little. I'd love to know like what your childhood was like, but also like what got you fascinated by toddlers.
For these very, very little people who are not quite in our world yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in Ohio and in Cleveland Heights, just right outside of Cleveland. And it was me and my two brothers. I'm smack in the middle. And we grew up at a time that I think there was a lot of freedom for children. Some children have that today, some don't. But, we were kind of, I don't want to say we were totally on our own. We had very loving parents, but they went off to work and we went off to school and we came home and had a lot of time, I think, with each other, squabbling or getting along, and in the neighborhood with other people in the neighborhood and friends. And I was always observing children. I think even when I was still a child myself, I was very interested in how people interacted, and I had this sense that the adults didn't really understand children. I think that may be one piece that got me interested in toddlers, because if there's a not well understood group of people, it's children like under the age of 5, and the younger you get, I think the less we understand their world because it's so different than ours. And it's filled with joy. I think that initially was my attraction to younger children, was they communicate not with words but with their body and their expressions and their delight or their upset. And that was always very interesting to me. It still is.
Oh my gosh. So the craziness doesn't make you crazy. It just makes you fascinated.
Yeah, it makes me fascinated. I mean, believe me, it was much harder when it was my own toddlers, like going from work with families and young children and then coming home. It's always harder when it's your own children, but it was also really delightful. It was both. I still think it's the hardest time for parents, for myself, is when you have a house with young children, because they have high needs and we have a lot of other things going on.
Yeah, they're incredibly frustrating. I remember taking my daughter as a toddler to her Montessori classroom, and she was close enough we could walk there, and we'd walk. And I remember one time dropping her off at this amazing teacher's classroom. Shout out Holly Knox, you're amazing, still in my life. And just dropping her off and then crying. Sheer relief and like the difficulty of like being like, okay, God, I can just like, I think it was like I didn't have to like hold it all together for just a second, and then all of a sudden it was like I could just started crying. It was so easy. But then remembering then also that Ollie, when she had her own children, was like, oh my gosh, this is so hard, and was so frustrated and was having difficulties with her own children. So then it made me think like, oh, okay, it's human too.
Yeah, and we bring our human self to being a parent, and if you're anywhere within a reasonable range of adults, it's very hard to contend sometimes with the challenges of the younger children, and then it's equally delightful to have their joys and their really beautiful moments of connection.
Well, so then what are we not understanding about toddlers and preschoolers? Why are they so confounding to us?
Yeah. I think some of it is that we worry, parents, that there's a linear path to development. So if my child right now wants all of something and nothing is enough for them, we feel like they're greedy and that they're going to always be that way, as opposed to right now, your 3-year-old sees something they want and they want all of it, because that's where they are in life. I have needs, I want my needs filled, and as we fill them in some reasonable way, or we put up a reasonable limit, like, I wish you could have more cookies, that's enough, and we're going to put them away. There'll be more tomorrow or later. They start slowly, gradually, to get more reasonable because we're reasonable. But we see their behaviors as linear. I think we panic. But I think if we're truthful with ourselves, there's so many behaviors that toddlers show us that we would kind of like to do sometimes too. I ask my college students this. I teach a course in early development. These are Barnard College and Columbia College students. fantastic students. Like, if you were in a toddler mind right now, what would you love to do? Some of them are like, I'd like to tap dance all the way down Broadway, 42nd Street, Others are like, I'd like to just throw my gum wrapper and just throw it and not care. Because there's a sort of a freeness to toddlers as well, because they're just figuring out the world. So it's like, me, who am I?
I was talking to somebody here on the podcast, and they mentioned the idea of like thinking about kids like sort of 3 and under as developmentally as still infants. And to me, that really like made a lot of sense to me, where I know that when my daughters were 3 and under, I wasn't thinking of them as infants, and I was frustrated with them because I was thinking that they're so big and they should be able to do X and they should be able to do Y, and they should be able to listen and all these different things. But the idea of thinking of them as kind of mentally as like more like infants, really for me it was helpful in kind of having more acceptance of this phase, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, a 3-year-old on the day they turn 3 has only been in this world for 36 months. I mean, think back like what you were doing 36 months ago, right? It's like so little time. And I think what happens is, as soon as our children get some verbal ability, it doesn't even have to be a lot, but we're relieved, finally, we can communicate. And then if you have a particularly verbal child,
That's what I had, a very precociously verbal daughter.
Yeah.
Speak in full paragraphs of 2.
And then we think that maps onto everything else, and it doesn't. I'm always saying to parents, verbal can be up here, emotional is right where it should be, because the brain can't be faster than it's supposed to be emotionally. And so we have a long childhood, right? We know now that the prefrontal cortex, so everything up here that's going to allow a child to control their impulse, handle their emotions, but also do things like sequence, right? First I put my socks on, then I put my shoes on. The schedule, what's next. All of those pieces are developing well into their 20s. And I feel like when that data started to come out, now about 15 or more years ago, but it's still new, sort of in the slow field of gathering science, it was like, yeah, of course. So now go backwards. If college students or young adults are just finishing that part of their brain development, not that it's not going to adjust over time, but go backwards, then your 3-year-old or even your 5-year-old is very, very new in this world. They might be verbal, but they're still about me. And that's what's so challenging for parents. I'm always saying, as you're pointing out, they're babies. Like when parents are very frustrated, she should know better, he doesn't do this. I say, I know, but he's more baby than big. And that's the piece to remember.
Yeah, we want to kind of rush it, I guess. We want to kind of get them to be big and have these expectations. I mean, although we're also told that it's good to have high expectations, right? I mean, some people tell parents that. What do you think for parents of preschoolers and toddlers? How can we right-size our way of thinking about this?
Yeah. I think the way to think of it is, how can I respect my child as a separate human being from me, but also get that they need me? So I think of it more about sort of respecting who they are, particularly when they're very different from yourself, or who you thought they would be, or who you want them to be. But understanding that development is kind of up, down, up, down, up, down. So, think of those good days that we have with our young child, and we're like, phew, they're finally getting it. They're growing up. They can focus. I easily got them to school. And then the next day, it all falls apart. That's typical development, right? If we think of it more like, well, what are my expectations and are they too high? I think if anything, particularly with our firstborns, we tend to have expectations way too high. And if you have that verbal child like you do, like I did with my first one, like way out there, our expectations go way up because we immediately go, oh, they're like us. Oh, now we're on an equal playing field. I'm like, no, that's a 4-year-old. On a good day, it's going to be great. On a hard day, it's going to be hard. So it's actually thinking about, so what are my expectations and are they too high? And almost any time you're having challenges with your child, your expectations are too high.
Yeah, they're not necessarily, it's our mindset really shifts the way we handle those things too. Like if we're thinking they're trying to manipulate me, or, I hear that from
A lot.
parents still. They know what they're doing, they're trying to do this, or they're giving me a problem, or things like that. But if we think about it instead of they're having a problem, I don't know, what are some of the kind of like, are there things that parents are still thinking that you notice, like that sort of assigning intent to
For
children?
sure.
Are we doing that a lot still?
Yeah, I think it's probably human nature, and then with all the pressures on parents and all the sort of social media, do this, my child did that. In all of that, we tend to then push it down to our children rather than understanding that this is one human being right in front of me. And what's our goal? Our goal is over time, it's a long time, this is the beginning of it with a young child. I want to raise a decent human being. And I feel like that's really the work I do. That's the work you do, right? I'm like, how do you raise a decent human being? Well, it takes a long time. And it takes a lot of understanding their world. And so in many ways we have to flip it. It's not she should know better or he's doing this to upset me, because that's what manipulation would be, thinking that your child had some kind of almost evilness in them and they're just trying to get me. But is to flip it and say, he's trying to figure out the world. He's trying to figure out his sense of power, his sense of agency. So when you go back to your child and you say something like, I see you're upset, I get it. You're not going to like this, but we got to get your shoes on and get out the door. It's like instant empathy, right? I'm telling you that I know you're going to be upset about what's coming next, says, see you, I hear you. And at the same time, it says, we got to get you to school and I've got to get to work, or I've got to get to wherever I'm going. So you can both have that limit, but be really understanding. Or you say, I'm going to put your shoes on today, even when you know your child is perfectly capable at other times of doing it.
Yeah, let it go when your child's like, you put my pants on today, they've done it,
Yeah.
20 times already. You're like, it's not the end of the world.
Yeah. It's the message of, today I feel like I need a little bit more. And you just go like, yeah, I'm going to give it to you. Oh, do you need me to put your pants on today? Of course. Today I'll do it. And you put their pants on, and you don't have to battle. You have, that term, pick your battles carefully. I mean, you really have to think like, do I care if I'm the one who puts their pants on? Do I care if she wears the yellow shirt today? What can I let go of? Because the big things do matter. And you are going to hold my hand crossing the street, and you do have to sit in a car seat or booster in the car. Like, there are things that do matter, and there's other things you can let go of.
I think I had a hard time with that because there were so many power struggles in my own family that it felt like I remember feeling like with some of those things, like that I'm losing, or I'm losing face, or I'm not, it was like a win-lose thing where I felt like I was losing if I just said, okay, I'll put on your pants today.
Mm-hmm.
Where I have this incredible stubborn streak, and, was really taught by my upbringing to the win the battle is the most important thing. And it's incredibly hard to move from that to letting that little stuff go, even though mentally you're like, I want to let the little stuff go, it can be so hard.
Yeah, I mean, look, you bring up such an important point, which is this self-awareness. And in my new book, in Raising Resilience, I have this whole piece, what I call the you factor, Y-O-U, and reflective questions, because about who am I? Like, what am I bringing to this? What upsets me in this? How was I treated as a child? Just like you're saying, because we are human, we come to this parenting mode. It's a relationship. So we're in relationship with our children, and that relationship is two separate people, or eventually the infant is almost part of you, but as the child moves out in the world, it's two distinct people who are also together. And it's in that relationship that all of our feelings and all of our background comes out. And so the more aware of it a parent can be, anybody listening, and I say self-awareness is a huge step, because sometimes parents will say, well, I'm aware that it's this dynamic from my childhood, but awareness isn't changed. No, not yet. But first you have to become aware, and it's a huge step. And then you say to yourself, okay, so what am I going to say to myself in those moments? Like, she's just a little girl. She's not trying to beat me at anything. She needs her say. She's just a little girl. Like something in your head that goes, exhale, I've got this.
Let go a little. Yeah, when my daughters were little, that was when Frozen came out, and I was like,
Yeah.
no, let it go. I mean, I remember battling the jacket battle at winter time
Yeah.
and insisting, and just like, no, you can't go out until, and why did I not, I look back at it now as an older parent and think, why did I not just
Yeah.
say, okay, I'm just going to grab this jacket in case you need it? Like, it was a
Right.
whole big thing. And it didn't have to be. And I
Yeah.
think that I would love for my listeners to be able to leave
Yeah. And also, just all of those mistakes that we all make. I'm just thinking of the same snowsuit that I was just insistent one of my children wear because it was bitter cold that day, and I could not let go of it, right? But you're not going to win. The child feels terrible. And when you say to your child, all right, you're not cold. I mean, think of it. We're getting dressed inside. We're all warm inside. They may not like the feeling of all those layers inside, and we're saying to them it's cold. And the young children live in right now I'm not cold. And that idea of, well, you might be cold later, your hands might be cold later, that's like not even in their realm of thinking. But when you take the coat and they turn to you at some point crying, and they say, I'm cold, and you say, have your coat, that's the message of I'm here to take care of you. That's actually where we build their trust. Mommy knew. Mommy knew.
Yeah, that sense of safety, of taking care of, and seen and heard their needs.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's what gives us, I mean, all of those things, and then we have to sort of hold those boundaries with toddlers, right? Like we want to create those connections, but then we have to hold boundaries. You have a great example in your new book about holding boundaries. You talk about pulling your screaming 4-year-old across major intersections because they just
Yeah.
want to hold your hand. Tell us about that.
Yeah.
How you handled it at the time.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is the part of like, as a parent, what is it that stops you from upsetting your child? So one of my children went through a long phase. It wasn't just a phase, it was a long time, wanting to do everything by himself, including crossing major intersections in New York City. And I was like, that's a no-brainer to me. Like, you have to hold my hand across any street, really, in a city. And he would, be happy-go-lucky. We'd get to the corner. I'd go to take his hand. He'd start screaming. And I would literally have to drag him across the street. He wouldn't let me carry him. And he'd be screaming, and I'd worry that I was going to be arrested. And I would get to the other side, and I would let go of his hand, like on the other side, safety, and he would be fine. And if I said something like, today, do you want to do that without screaming? He'd go, no. So if you think about it, like, right? That's a determined human being. I mean, he's kind of a spitting image of me, so I have to say personality-wise, I was like, okay, I get it. I was probably the same way. But the point is, I had a real limit there, which was safety. It wasn't like a negotiation. I wasn't explaining it every single time we got to a street corner. You walk a lot in New York City. But we did it, and he would get to the other side and be fine. It was about power. He wanted the power. And you know what? I didn't care what he wore, when he wanted a particular shirt and we had to, get it out of the laundry, fine. But when it came to crossing the street or having to be buckled in the car, which he hated, he didn't like being constrained in any way. So I had to figure out, where does he really have to be constrained? And I'll just have to deal with the screaming.
How did you deal with the screaming?
Just as I was saying, I think as a parent, now he's also my second, it's easier. It's easier the second time around or the third time around, I found. But, which is, I think for parents, when our children are upset with us or publicly upset, and there's people looking at you, which there are, but even at home, we don't like it. We want our children somehow to say all the time, like, oh, I just love you, mommy or daddy, you're so great. That's not how it works. It's back and forth. Sometimes they're happy, sometimes they're not happy with you. When you say to your children it's bedtime and they don't want to go to sleep, they're going to be upset. And those are actually the moments that we build such strength in our relationship with them and in them, which says, I've got this. Like, I as the parent have this. And I had to remind myself, he can be upset, but this limit is not being changed. And then really think through which limits matter. I think you have to always go back to that. Do I really care, like you're saying, if she wears the winter coat? And if you ask yourself enough times, you probably say, no, because if she's not cold, I can carry it.
Yeah. And I think that as much as I hate war metaphors, pick your battles is a really important one for parents.
Yeah.
So you believe that parents are fundamental in acting as emotional buffers and mediators. What does that mean?
Yeah. So, there's a lot of literature on stress and the stress mechanisms in the brain. I always say, like, stress and emotional arousal is the head and the heart, right? It's the whole person. But where is it going on? It's going on first in the brain. And when children get stressed, and they're young, it's the parents that help them through it. So if you go back a little bit and you think of the infant, in your arms and our arms, right? We take care of their needs, food, comfort, changing them, whatever it is, we try to figure out. Some babies are harder to figure out than others. As they get older, you're doing the same thing but stepping back a bit. So all those times that we say to our child, like, oh, that is frustrating. I get it, that's frustrating. We're helping them manage these negative emotions without taking them away. And each time we do that, it's like almost like a training module. The brain goes, stress, arousal. Okay, somebody's helping me handle it and bring it back down. Stress, arousal. It's like a back and forth mechanism. And it takes a lot of practice. And what we hope for is that our children don't get overly stressed. But some stress is actually healthy. And that's borne out in the neuroscience and in the developmental literature. So what's the buffer? The buffer is the parent saying, I'm here for you even when it's hard. I know you really don't want to go to school today. Put a little note in your backpack, and if you miss me, that little note is there. It says, you're not going to like this, and you may be upset, and there's stress. I'm also here with you, even when I'm not physically here with you. And it's that buffering between stress and child that helps mediate it so that they can learn to handle the stress over time, which then prepares them. We're doing this every day, by the way. Oh, you really wanted Cheerios and we're out of Cheerios. Your friend wouldn't play with you at school today. As children get older, all the disappointments, the teacher they don't like, the calculus tests that turned out to be different than they thought. When they come home any age and we're there to comfort them, that's a buffer every day. You're just automatically doing it. Every parent listening, you're doing it, I promise you, every single day. What we're doing is preparing them for when the bigger, worse things happen in life, and we don't know what they're going to be. I think every parent, I'm pretty convinced of it, every parent wants a child who can handle life, no matter what life gives them. And hopefully most of it is good, but some of it's going to be not so good, and some of it's going to be bad. That's the reality of life and living.
They have a pattern of what happens when things are bad. I have people in my life I can turn.
Yes.
I can weather this. I can move through this.
Yeah.
It may be uncomfortable, but I can move through this. I love that.
Yeah.
Our relationship, our attuned, kind of healthy relationship is a buffer. And I think it's also a buffer for when we have to cause the stress.
Yes.
We have to hold the boundary, things like that. I definitely remember at certain times, my daughters are 17 and 14 now, but saying having a kid be mad at me when she went to bed and saying, hey, honey, I know you're mad at me, but I'm here for you. I love you. I'm going to go to bed, whatever, maybe I didn't get the good night hug that night because you were mad.
Yeah.
It was but I'm still here for you, even though you're mad at me. Right.
That is the key. That is it. That's it. It's simple, but here's the foundation that every child needs to move out in the world. No matter how I feel, no matter how good or bad things are, no matter what I feel about my parents, I need to know that they still love me. And it doesn't mean you can stay up for 3 more hours. What it means is, yeah, you got to go to sleep. And even when you're mad at me, I still love you and I'll still see you in the morning. And then when you see them in the morning and you make them breakfast, you're back to your kind of more literally testing for the child. Oh, these feelings might be okay because that adult who I need so badly can handle them. It's also how they learn about things like anger. I have anger, parent, mommy or daddy gets angry, then we come back together. That's the big lesson that gets absorbed in their entire body. It's okay to get mad because that doesn't mean the relationship is over.
Yeah, it's not. It's that coming back together, that repair. That's the most important thing. And you talk about kids need their parental presence, and kind of veer from toddlers a little bit, but at all the ages, 3 and 15 and 20. Thinking about, I know an expert in toddlers, but thinking about this idea of like kids and teenagers, I think that's something I've realized, that sometimes we think as parents like, oh, basically my job is done by the time I get to high school, but actually these, your presence, my presence in this house, I feel super, super lucky and grateful that the work I do allows me to be here in this house, because even while I'm recording this podcast, I can look out this giant window and be like, bye, as Maggie drops off to her tutoring or whatever.
Yeah.
And it seems really important that for them to have that kind of presence there at this point.
Right.
And you're saying that's so
absolutely. And one of the questions that people ask me is like, how, at what point did you start working with families with children older? Well, part of it is, in our careers, we've been doing this for almost 3 decades or more than 3 decades, is that, on the one hand, on a day-to-day basis, I'm with toddlers and parents and young children, but then my work, say, with parents outside of my center and outside of Barnard, I'm a college professor, so I've always had these teenagers, young adults, which I love, right? Because there's so many similarities to the early years and then this kind of identity at 18, 19, 20. And then the more time I spent in the field and the more I asked questions about what's going on, the more I realized, wait, the basis, if I'm interested in studying and helping people get to a strong foundation, that is a strong foundation for what? And then my work became more and more kind of over time with elementary school age, middle school, high school, because the foundation is something that you want them to carry through. And then I would see the continuities, and then my own children were growing up, and I would say, wow, there's this continuity. That child always got upset about something like this, and he still does, but it takes a slightly different presence on my part to be there for them. Just like you're saying, wave to a teenager is enough. That may not be enough for a 4-year-old. But what's the commonality is, mommy's here. So it's a question of how do you keep stepping back? What kind of support do you need as a parent in that stepping back? But they need us through the whole thing. You can think about, how you called your parents when you got your first apartment or your first big job or, any of these things in adulthood. You might have called your parent or sent them a note or an email, right? That's still that checking in, like, I want to share this with you.
And you want that. You want to be there for that, all that. Okay.
Yeah.
Tova, would you mind if we go back to early childhood, go back to those younger years, and I give you some sort of rapid fire questions about the most difficult toddler parent situations? What are some of the best ways I'm going to ask maybe about bedtime and sibling fighting. Okay?
Yeah.
So one of the biggest things parents have so much trouble with is bedtime. Parents want to be able to have their kids go to bed and stay in a room, and while they can have maybe this one precious hour with each other before they go to bed. And kids are like, parents, stay with me, don't go.
Yeah.
What can parents do to navigate that kind of thing skillfully?
Yeah, so bedtime, going to sleep, is separation. I think if you switch your focus a little bit to any parent who's listening with a young and even these elementary age children, partly I think because of the pandemic, but you can have sleep issues at any age, but certainly in the toddler years. It's separation for your child, right? For us, it's like done with the day, tired, you go to sleep, I get time to myself or time with a partner. For the child, it's yet another goodbye. So when you think of it that way, sometimes you handle it differently. You know, everybody's heard you need a bedtime routine. Why? Because it keeps saying to the child every night, here's what we do, here's how we wind down, here's the book, the lights are low, there might be a white noise machine, lullaby music or something. They're cues literally to their system. This is getting closer to bedtime. So it's actually a calming. Now for some children it's upsetting. The music's on, you know, or uh-oh, the bath is happening. For the parent, it's the ability to say, sleep is more important than anything I could possibly give my child. And I honestly believe that. I think the data bears that out, but you also know that anecdotally, right? When we're tired, we're not at our best. When our child is sleep deprived, they can't handle all of that they're asked to do in a day, let alone in the morning.
Absolutely.
So the routine matters, the kind of the sameness to some extent matters. And then for the parent, it's doing that work on self. Why is it so hard for me to say, it's okay if you cry, I'm going to still see you in the morning? Because if it's separation, which it is, then the reunion is the morning. I'm going to see you in the morning, I always do, and I'll make you breakfast. You can give children something to sleep with. Some children like to sleep with a t-shirt of a parent. I often suggest a photo of the family. And then saying to the child, this is with you all night, and I always see you in the morning, even if you need to cry right now. It's almost giving them permission for the release. And then saying goodnight. But when the child feels like, I really don't want to say goodnight, why would they want to? For that child who doesn't want to. And then the parent hesitates. It actually makes children feel less comfortable or less secure. Mommy can't handle this. Daddy's not handling it. Now what do I do? But when we say to them, I got this. You need sleep. I need sleep. I'll see you tomorrow. They feel calmer.
Okay, so get in your own head and get.
You have to get in.
This is the best thing for your kid. Yes,
And ask yourself, what were my experiences as a child? You know, so often, I work privately with parents, I work in parent groups, and so often when I ask that question for a parent who's really struggling with bedtime, they have some very vivid story about either being forced to go to sleep, feeling like their parents weren't patient enough, or just feeling not responded to as a child. Not enough. It doesn't mean that the parents were horrible people, but my parents weren't there for me, then it's very hard to think that saying to your child, it's okay if you cry, I'm going to still see you in the morning, is doable. But children look to us to say, I've got this. We're good. You're going to sleep. I'll see you tomorrow. They respond to that.
Okay, that's a lovely, succinct way of putting that. Okay, what about when they're fighting with their siblings? How should we respond? Should we be going in and breaking it up? Should we not be going in and breaking it up? What should we do with sibling fighting?
So this is one of the most common questions, I'm sure you know that too, like that I get when I'm working with parents, because, and again, we bring ourselves to this. What's my history? You know, if you're an only child and you have children who are screaming at each other, it's scary. If you had siblings, you have to ask yourself, did I fight with them? What I find is that people who had really love, hate, and I always have to say like lowercase h, you know, not, but I love you, I hate you, I love you, I don't love you, I want to be with you, I don't want to be with you. If people tend to remember that from their own childhood, they tend to also be close to their siblings as adults. Even if they say something like, you know, we're so different, we don't have a lot in common, but wow, we have each other's back. You know, I call my sister, I call my brother, when we get together, you know, that kind of. But siblings are being asked to share the most precious thing in their life, called parents. Whether you're a single parent, whether there's two of you. And it's a little bizarre, right? Wait, I need mommy, and now I've got to compete with you on this one. And so you tend to hear your children, like if you have a caregiver. My children were very young. We had a caregiver, and I would come home, and she'd say they're fine until you get here. So I had to say to her, like, listen, you can't say that when I walk in after a long day, and like, you know, and I want to be with them. Like, of course, like when the parent is there, they can be their full self. Good, bad, happy, mad, they can be everything. That's the person they trust the most. When they're with grandparents, they tend to be on better behavior no matter how close they are. Babysitters, they tend to be, you know, you'll hear those reports like, oh my God, she's so great at school, but at home. So what do? I always see this as the only reason any of us give our child a sibling, let alone another sibling or another one, is that we want them to have each other. Right? And we want that for life. So I really see it as like, the children in relationship on one side, the parents in relationship on another side, meaning the children have to have their own relationship. And you allow that by saying to them, you've got each other for life. Sometimes it's fun, sometimes it's not. Because we have to help them address the downside. It's really not fun sometimes, I get it. That's your sister. That's your brother. If you do that, or if you have a baby and you say to the older one, and everyone's like, oh, she's so sweet, or he's so kind, but they're mulling over, I don't like that baby. But they're hugging, and everyone's like, oh, you're so sweet, you're so sweet, you're so sweet. When you say to the child, you don't have to love that baby all the time. She does cry a lot. Or, I sure have to spend a lot of time with that baby, don't I? It says to the child, these feelings are okay. And then what do you do when they're fighting? This is, again, where you have to know yourself. Like, what's your limit? I mean, people say to me all the time, well, is it okay if they hit? Is it okay if they say mean things? I say, that's personal, right? I think siblings who are close are capable of saying the meanest things to each other because it's part of their relationship. And I can remember times saying to my boys who are so close, but I would say to them sometimes, I heard what you said to your brother. And they'd say, yeah, Mom, you tell us all the time we're siblings. That's why we said it. Because in the heat of the moment, they're free as they could be. And I'd think, holy smokes, like, did he really just yell that nasty thing? And then 5 minutes later, they'd be playing together, doing something collaboratively. So if you can stay out of it as much as possible and give your children the message, that's your brother, that's your sister, you can figure this out, or you can handle this. You can handle this as really neutral, right? Handling it might be saying, I don't want to be with you and going in another room. Handling it might be, throwing their sibling's toy and saying, you're dumb, or whatever it is that's on their mind. It can be far worse than that. Or it may be coming to some reasonable, or they think reasonable, decision. Sometimes it doesn't seem reasonable to us, but it does to them. But as a parent, you can also have a limit where you go and you say, enough, it's enough. The problem with the intervention is we have to do it neutrally. And we tend to go in and blame one child or the other. And every parent listening is going to say, like, oh yeah, I blame the oldest, or I blame the sort of feistiest who's been labeled the troublemaker, or I blame the one who admits it. Sometimes there's a child who goes, yeah, I just hit her. They're like, yeah. But if you want to break it up, because we all have our limits, it's to go in and say, it's enough. This isn't working. Everybody take a break. And usually when you do that, they go running back to each other. No, we want to be together. And you say, all right, well, cool it a little bit because, that's more than I can handle right now. But it's about us more than it is about them. As long as you're seeing loving, connected, joyful moments, sometimes.
All right. I love that. You heard it here. It's your listener from Dr. Tovah Klein, College Center for Toddler Development. Tovah, this has been such a pleasure to talk to you, and I can really see the joy in your face as you think about these little crazy creatures. Anything that we missed that you might want to share with the listener? And before you answer that, I just want to mention Tovah's new book is Raising Resilience, How to Help Our Children Thrive in Times of Uncertainty. It's great. I recommend it. You get it anywhere books are sold. To you. Anything we missed that we need to share?
Well, we could probably talk all day, right, about this topic, but I think the thing for parents to know is that children are forgiving. And in a loving relationship that's basically loving, there's going to be mishaps. There's going to be really big mishaps. There's going to be bad things that happen in their lives, their world. Children want to know that they can come back to you. And that has to come from us. That's a big premise of my book, Raising Resilience, and unpacking, well, what does that mean to be in relationship with a child and raise them to be these decent human beings to handle life, is that there's going to be a lot of mishaps. It's so far from perfection. And there's a lot of messaging today of like, do it right. And there's not one way to love a child. There are many ways to love a child, as long as you can accept that it's going to be an up and down road.
Remember, the up and the down is something I am taking away from it. Development is the up and down. It's gonna be the up and down. We're here through the ups and downs. So, Dr. Tovah Klein's new book, Raising Resilience. Tovah, thank you so much for coming on the Mindful Parenting podcast and sharing your time and your expertise and your joy with us. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure to be here too.